As a seasoned truck driver, I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing could prepare me for what happened one foggy night on an isolated stretch of Highway 12. It was late October, and I was hauling a load of equipment across the mountains. The weather had turned unexpectedly grim, with dense fog rolling in from every direction. Visibility was poor, and the headlights of my rig barely cut through the thick mist. My radio crackled with static, making communication nearly impossible. The fog seemed to grow thicker with every mile, wrapping around my truck like a suffocating shroud. I was driving carefully, my eyes straining to make out the road. That's when I first heard it, soft, almost imperceptible whispers drifting through the fog. I thought it might be my imagination, but the murmuring grew louder and more distinct. "Help us, help us," the voices seemed to say, barely audible over the hum of the engine. My heart began to race. I reached for the radio to call for assistance, but the static was relentless. I decided to pull over and wait for the fog to clear, hoping that the whispers would vanish. I parked my truck on the side of the road, the engine's rumble fading into the eerie silence of the fog. The whispers continued, now sounding almost like a chorus of desperate pleas. I could make out a few words: lost, never found. Feeling unnerved, I stepped outside the cab. The cold, damp air hit me immediately, and I could barely see the outlines of the trees and road signs through the fog. I called out, but the only response was the increasing volume of the whispers. They seemed to be coming from all around, as if the fog itself was alive and speaking. I climbed back into the truck, trying to calm myself. As I started the engine, the whispers abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was almost more unsettling. I began to drive again, slowly making my way through the fog. The road twisted and turned, and every shadow seemed to hold some unseen threat. After what felt like hours, the fog began to lift, and I saw a small, dilapidated gas station up ahead. I decided to stop and refuel, hoping to take a break and regain my composure. The station was deserted, its neon sign flickering weakly. I filled the tank and went inside to pay. The inside of the station was just as rundown as the outside, with dusty shelves and flickering fluorescent lights. An old man stood behind the counter, looking at me with an expression that seemed both tired and wary. "Quite a night to be out there," he said in a gravelly voice. I nodded, mentioning the strange whispers I had heard. His expression changed to one of concern. "Many drivers have reported similar things on this stretch of highway," he said. "Some say it's the spirits of those who got lost and never found their way out. You should be careful." I thanked him and left the station, the old man's words echoing in my mind. As I climbed back into my truck, the fog began to roll in again, thicker than before. The whispers returned, now more insistent and frantic. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, and no matter how fast I drove, the fog clung to me like a shroud. The whispers grew louder, and I could almost feel them pressing in on me, wrapping around my truck like a living entity. My anxiety turned to panic as I realized that the road I was on was becoming increasingly unfamiliar. I tried to find a place to pull over, but the fog made it impossible to see any signs or landmarks. The whispers became a cacophony of voices, each one pleading for help. The fog seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the swirling mist creating strange shapes and shadows that danced at the edge of my vision. Finally, I saw a dim light ahead, a small house or building, and I pulled over, hoping to find some help. As I approached, the fog began to clear, revealing an old, abandoned cabin. The light came from a single, flickering bulb hanging outside, casting eerie shadows on the ground. I got out of the truck, feeling both relieved and apprehensive. I approached the cabin, but as I got closer, I noticed that it was falling apart, windows broken, door hanging off its hinges. The whispers grew even louder, filling the air with a sense of overwhelming dread. I hesitated but decided to investigate, hoping to find some answers. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The cabin was empty, except for a dusty old table and a few broken chairs. On the wall was a tattered old map, showing the very stretch of highway I had been driving on. Next to it was a weathered journal, its pages filled with frantic, handwritten notes. The notes described similar experiences. Drivers lost in the fog, hearing whispers, and never being seen again. It was clear that whoever had written these notes had been desperate to find their way out, but had never succeeded. My heart pounded as I realized that I might be facing the same fate. I left the cabin quickly and got back into my truck, determined to drive out of the fog no matter what. The whispers had grown quieter, but the sense of impending doom remained. I drove for hours, the fog eventually lifting as dawn approached. Exhausted and shaken, I finally reached a familiar stretch of highway. I made it to my destination, but the experience left me profoundly disturbed. I never drove that route again, and I always wonder about the others who may have encountered the same haunting whispers. The fog on Highway 12 remains one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, a chilling reminder of the unknown and the restless spirits that may dwell in the mist. I have been a truck driver for over 20 years. I've seen it all on the roads: accidents, strange sights, and the occasional ghost story. But nothing prepared me for that one night on Route 87. This is the story I swore I would never tell, but it's time to share it. Maybe it will serve as a warning for others. It was a dark, moonless night. I was driving a long haul from Denver to Phoenix. The weather was clear, but a heavy feeling hung in the air. It felt like the night itself was alive, watching and waiting. I brushed it off as fatigue and turned up the radio to keep myself awake. Around midnight, the truck started acting up. The lights flickered, and the engine made a strange knocking sound. I pulled over to the side of the road to check it out. When I stepped out of the cab, the silence hit me. No crickets, no wind, just an eerie stillness. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the hood, but everything seemed fine. As I was about to close it, I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. "Who's there?" I called out, shining the flashlight around. Nothing. Just the empty road stretching into the darkness. I felt a chill run down my spine but convinced myself it was just my imagination. I got back into the truck and continued my journey. An hour later, I saw a hitchhiker standing by the side of the road, thumbing for a ride. Normally, I wouldn't pick up strangers, especially not at this hour, but something compelled me to stop. The hitchhiker was a tall, thin man with hollow eyes and a haunting look. He didn't say much, just thanked me and climbed into the passenger seat. We drove in silence for a while. I tried making small talk, but he only gave short, cryptic answers. His presence made me uneasy, but I didn't want to be rude. Finally, he spoke up. "Do you believe in ghosts?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not really," I replied. "But I've heard some stories." He smiled, but it was a cold, lifeless smile. "You're about to experience one." Before I could react, he vanished. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. The truck skidded to a stop, and I jumped out, looking for any sign of the hitchhiker. There was nothing. Just the empty road in the darkness. I felt like I was losing my mind. I got back into the truck, determined to reach the next town as quickly as possible. The air inside the cab felt colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the darkness of the trailer, was the hitchhiker, staring at me with those hollow eyes. I floored the gas pedal, trying to outrun the terror. The truck roared down the highway, but the figure in the mirror didn't move. I could feel his gaze burning into the back of my head. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, playing an old, eerie tune that sounded like it came from another time. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. I knew I was lost, trapped in some nightmarish loop. Panic set in, and I felt my grip on reality slipping. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw a light up ahead. A small diner, its neon sign flickering weakly. I pulled into the parking lot, the engine sputtering to a stop. I rushed inside, desperate for human contact. The diner was empty, except for a lone waitress behind the counter. She looked up as I entered, her expression one of mild surprise. "Rough night?" she asked. "You have no idea," I replied, my voice trembling. "There's something out there. A man. A ghost." "I don't know." She nodded slowly. "You're not the first to see him. They say he's been haunting these roads for years. A trucker, just like you, who lost his life in a crash not far from here. They say he can't rest, always looking for a ride." I felt a shiver run through me. "What do I do?" She gave me a sad smile. "You drive. Keep moving, and maybe you'll outrun him. Or maybe you'll join him." I left the diner, my mind reeling. I climbed back into the truck, praying for the nightmare to end. As I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The hitchhiker was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief and pulled back onto the highway. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but the memory of that night haunts me to this day. I still don't know if it was real or just a product of my exhausted mind. But every time I pass that stretch of road, I can't help but look for the hitchhiker, wondering if he'll appear again. So, if you ever find yourself driving down Route 87 on a moonless night, keep your eyes on the road and don't stop for any strangers. You never know who, or what, might be looking for a... As a long-haul truck driver, I've spent countless hours driving through the night, navigating remote highways and desolate roads. But one night, I encountered something that still sends shivers down my spine. It was late autumn, and I was driving through the vast, empty stretches of Route 66. I'd been on the road for hours, the monotony of the highway illuminated only by my headlights. The weather was clear, but the air was crisp and cold. I remember feeling particularly on edge that night, as if something was lurking just beyond my vision. Around midnight, I spotted a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. The truck was unusually close, almost as if it were tailgating me. I checked my mirrors, but all I could see was a blinding glare from the oncoming vehicle. It was a massive, old-fashioned truck, nothing like the modern rigs you usually see. Its lights seemed to cast an eerie glow, and its engine roared with a sound that felt almost unnatural. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the road ahead. But the truck didn't pass. Instead, it stayed right behind me, its headlights like twin eyes staring into the back of my cab. My anxiety grew with every mile. I decided to pull over at the next rest stop, hoping that the other driver would do the same and I could have a word. I pulled into a small, rundown rest area. It was deserted, save for a few old vending machines and a payphone that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I got out of my truck, my boots crunching on the gravel as I waited. Minutes ticked by, and the other truck never appeared. I scanned the dark highway, but there was no sign of it. I got back into my truck, trying to shake off the unsettling experience. As I pulled back onto the highway, I glanced in my mirrors once more. The other truck was still there, now seemingly closer, but just as silent. I decided to speed up, thinking that maybe I could outdistance it. Despite my efforts, the truck stayed right on my tail. The road was straight and deserted for miles, with no other traffic. The strange truck continued to follow me, its presence becoming more oppressive. The engine's growl seemed to echo in the silence, and every now and then, a burst of cold air would seep through the cab, even though my heater was on full blast. After what felt like an eternity, I saw lights in the distance, a small town up ahead. I pulled off the highway, seeking refuge in a local diner. I parked the truck and sat in the dimly lit diner, trying to calm my nerves. I ordered a coffee and waited, glancing outside every few minutes. When I finally ventured out to check on my truck, it was gone. I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. It was as if the truck had never existed at all. I drove through the town, searching for any sign of the strange vehicle, but found nothing. Back on the road, I remained vigilant, the experience lingering in my mind. I never saw the truck again, but I often wonder about that night. Was it a ghostly apparition, a prank by another driver, or something else entirely? The truck's presence was too unsettling to dismiss as just a figment of my imagination. To this day, that night remains one of the most haunting experiences of my trucking career. The Phantom Hauler, as I've come to call it, serves as a chilling reminder of the strange and inexplicable events that can occur on the open road. Make sure you follow and subscribe to this channel, or you might never ever see or hear my amazing stories again.